Hello and welcome to the Brutal Iron Gym podcast, where our goal is to cut through the BS and deliver the brutal truth about topics related to health and happiness. So today's topic is nutrition, and we're going to discuss sodium. We're going to cover some health and kind of performance effects of sodium. And the first thing typically we want to address with this is sodium bad? Like, is salt bad? Hell no. There's a ton of good things salt does for us when kept in a correct amount. Too little of sodium is actually a bad thing, okay? Just as much as we would think of too much sodium as a bad thing. So, typically when I talk to people about sodium, general population, they're going to be worried about blood pressure effects. So when I talk with athletes and stuff, we're actually trying to get sodium in them, or we're trying to manipulate it for weigh-ins. So we're going to talk about that part here as well. But really, like, what you do with sodium depends on what your goal or your target outcome is. So for most people, if they're just trying to live a healthy life, they're going to be they're really only going to ever pay attention to sodium when they have blood pressure issues. And the sad part is that sodium being connected with blood pressure is ridiculously overblown. So they've done a lot of studies and research and blah, 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 that way less than 50% of people test out to be sensitive to sodium in regards to their blood pressure, so causing hypertension. And it doesn't really matter what that percentage is. So you can actually test for yourself to see kind of how you respond. So you can get blood pressure kits online. I used to do blood pressure with people all the time when I used to teach at the university. I even did a study where I would do blood pressure with people while they were walking on a treadmill yapping at me, which was a pain in the ass. But blood pressure is not that hard to take. They have so many automated things now, and you can even go to CVS pharmacies or whatever the hell other pharmacies there are, Walgreens and whatnot, and they typically have, by the pharmacy section, they have those sit-down machines where you put your arm in a cuff. I think Walmart's have them and stuff now. So it's not that hard to check your blood pressure if you actually give a shit and you want to do it. So what you can do is to eat normal foods throughout your day, and then maybe before you test it, about an hour or 2 hours before you want to test your blood pressure, you can have a meal high in sodium. And we're going to cover at the end what are foods that are high in sodium. So for example, one of them is soups. So soups tend to be very high in sodium. So you can go out to a restaurant, have a big bowl of soup, then go check your blood pressure at the local pharmacy, and you can see if it reads high. Now, it would be thorough testing would be to test what you have before the meal, then go have the meal, then test after the meal. You can do that if you care enough, or if you have a blood pressure checker at home, cuff and whatnot at home. So typically, if you consider yourself to be of normal health and or you don't believe you already have hypertension issues, then your blood pressure is going to be kind of normal at all times. So then when you check it after a meal, if all of a sudden it's sky high, then you would know that maybe you're sensitive. So there are other really easy ways to address blood pressure as well. So celery seed extract is very cheap, and that's something you can take every day that has a pretty good effect on blood pressure control. But in general, the most common causes for high blood pressure is stress, overweight, and inactivity. And then you can throw in genetics. Sodium is not the problem in 99% of the cases. Now, should you check it? Hell yeah. Check it and address it if it is an issue. If you find out you're sensitive, then reduce it. But just reducing sodium isn't going to make that big of an effect. And don't just blame sodium for everything before you would test it and find out if that's actually true for you. So most people, stress is the problem. Then being overweight and inactive are going to be the problems. And then some genetics. So I've worked with people in their 20s and 30s who've had high blood pressure before. And they'll say, oh, it's genetics. But yet they're stressed out. They're either overweight or they're slightly overweight. And they're usually not very active in terms of physical activity and exercise. So they go to work, they work a really stressful kind of 8 to 10 hour a day job. Then they go home, try to unwind by drinking wine and sitting on their ass in front of the TV. and then they blame sodium or they blame genetics. And it's like, no, you're stressed, you're overweight, you're inactive. So you got to find a way to deal with stress mentally. So, and we have talked about that in past podcasts. So let me look up a reference number if you would be interested in that. So most people are aware that they could do better with reducing stress. It depends on what your stress is coming from. So we had a series way back in the 200s of number of podcasts where we talked about overcoming stress. And we talked about worry. So stress over worrying. We talked about stress over hurrying, like you're always feeling in a rush. Stress even over like social media and people pleasing and getting along with others. And then even like stress of fear of the future. So we've talked about those 6 ones. And there are podcasts 215, 218, 221, 224, 227, and 230. And I'll put reference notes in the kind of description area for the podcast, today's podcast. But those are the podcasts in the 200s. So 215, 18, 21, 24, 27, and 30. So we have information available on how to reduce stress. But a lot of it just comes down to the mindset of understanding what you can or can't control in life. And if you can't control something, control the hell out of it. Do your best you can. If you can't control it, learn to let it go. So, yes, is stress a problem that everybody faces? Pretty much. Is it a problem that you can do something about to reduce? Yes, absolutely, 100%. So people are going to say, oh, I can't get rid of stress. I have this problem, I have that problem, I have this problem. You're not so damn special. Everybody has problems, okay? Everybody has stress. But you can learn how to reduce yours and or better manage it. Can you eliminate stress? Probably not. And like when people like me mention that stress is an issue, we're not imagining that you're going to completely eliminate stress and live as if you're frolicking in a meadow. So we understand stress is part of life. But if you're currently not doing jack shit about your stress levels, that's pretty lazy. Go do something, okay? Work to control it a little bit. So if you stress over being angry and pissed off all the time, try to figure out how to be less angry and pissed off all the time. Okay? Doesn't mean you can't ever be angry, but try to live a little less angry. And whatever else kind of stress you deal with. So address it in some way. So if your answer to hypertension is, well, I'm just not going to salt my foods, that is stupidly lazy. Borderline insignificant. And then it's probably just going to give you a false sense of doing something when you're actually not. And then if you try to avoid foods that have sodium in them, so not only you're not going to salt them, but you're going to avoid foods that have sodium, like soups, like cured meats, or bacon, stuff like that. Okay, that's something you can do. But is that a meaningful, very significant thing? Probably not. It's better to address stress. It's better to address being overweight. It's better to address inactivity. Way, way, way more than just avoiding sodium and not salting your foods. That's a bullshit, lazy, kind of false sense of doing something. So don't do that to yourself, okay? Don't believe the bullshit you tell yourself in your head. Try to actually address the things that'll actually make a difference and the things that'll actually matter. So, now I just yelled at everybody for like 8 minutes. But, so when it comes to like sodium, if you're worried about sodium and its effects on blood pressure, it's very unlikely that that's going to be a significant culprit. And it's absolutely unlikely it's going to be the biggest culprit, okay? So if you want to know if you're sensitive to sodium, you can test it, like we said. So go eat a high sodium meal and then go check your blood pressure at some pharmacy or something like that. If it's sky high, then hey, you know that maybe sodium is an issue for you and you do want to look at maybe addressing that or controlling it. But also look at stress, being overweight, and inactivity. And don't just blame genetics. Okay? Try to work on what you can control. You can't control genetics, but you can control stress. You can control being overweight, and you can control your activity. So don't just say, oh, everything's outside of my control, and then let yourself live unhealthy and die. Okay? You might have the best excuse in the world, but if you die young, you're dead. So why not dump your excuses and actually put some actions to it? Okay? Cool. Now, the other things that we look at when we think of sodium is its effects during like weight loss or fat loss programs. So sodium, when combined with carbohydrates and water, that forms a compound called glycogen in our body. The reason why we care about that is because if we have carbohydrates and water available to us in our diet, and we eat foods that have sodium, we are likely to store the water along with the carbohydrates. Okay? And the sodium, we're going to store that water, and that water will make us heavier. So, if you're in a fat loss diet, and you have foods you typically consume from day-to-day basis, and then all of a sudden you eat a food very high in sodium, for the next anywhere from like 2 to 12 hours, kind of depends on a whole bunch of things, but for the next period of time, like half day to a day, you will have higher body weight due to water retention. You did not eat a meal and all of a sudden gain 2 pounds of body fat. You just are simply holding 2 pounds of water that is stored with carbohydrates and the sodium. Okay? So, if you have varying degrees of sodium intake, you will have varying effects of weight, body weight, when you look at a scale, because you'll have varying amounts of water retention. So when people consume very consistent diets, eating the same foods every single day, then their weight loss, as seen on a scale, will be more predictive of actual fat loss. If you vary your foods per day, and even if you control your caloric intake, even if you control carbohydrates, and even if you control water, but you don't control the exact milligram of sodiums, that, like, no, it shouldn't be plural, you don't control the exact milligram of sodium that you have per day, then you will have variance in water weight. Therefore, you will have variance in body weight. Okay? So, we've talked about in the past in podcasts that body weight can change from day to day for a bajillion reasons. Okay? Some of them outside of your control, some of them within your control. So, if you have a variance per day within a 2% window, you're doing fine. Okay? That's a normal variance. So, if I weighed 150 one day, the next day I weigh 150.5, you did not gain 0.5 pounds of fat. You just have some kind of variance due to change of lifestyle, change of activity, change of food, a whole bunch of stuff. Maybe you just drank a variable amount of water compared to the day before. So any variance within a 2% window is acceptable, normal, just going to happen. If you start eating super precise and you control everything you can, that variance is going to reduce down to like 1% or even 0.5%, but there's still some variance. Okay? So be aware of that. Another effect we have, kind of aesthetics and fat loss processing, is when you do have those times of higher water retention, because you ate something high in sodium, you will have more bloat, meaning you will feel puffy, okay? And that's because you have more water inside your skin and muscles. So sometimes when somebody has a bloat effect, so they have inconsistent amounts of sodium, they tend to have, maybe they went out with friends the night, they had some processed foods at a restaurant, and all of a sudden their sodium was really high. The next day they're going to have bloat, they're going to feel thicker in their thighs, their midsection, and often when I've worked with women and men in the past with eating disorders, this often triggered them to do like either to skip food all day or to have like a binge and purge type effect. But it often triggered bad behavior because they were afraid that they had gotten fat. It isn't fat, it's just water retention. So as long as they control their sodium the next day, they'll be fine. That water will come back out and they'll go back to normal by the end of the day or the next day. So anytime I'm working with people with eating disorders, we have control over our sodium. We try our best to control their sodium, not to zero. It's not healthy to have no sodium. We just want to have a healthy amount. So they've gone through and like the FDA has recommended variable amounts of like, say, 2,400 milligrams and whatnot. 1,600 if you're in this situation, 2,400 if you're in this situation, 3,200 if you're in that situation. But really what it matters is that you're just having a consistent amount from day to day. Okay? So if you don't have enough sodium, you can actually have like cramps, you can feel dehydrated a lot, you can just kind of feel run down, like you don't have very good energy, and you kind of just feel deflated, and it's just kind of a blah type mood, so your body doesn't feel good. Then when you have too much sodium, you have that bloat effect, okay? You just feel like a big puffy water balloon. And so we want to have somewhere in the middle. And what that looks like per person is different depending on their body mass, muscle mass versus fat mass, their activity style. Do they do manual labor or do they sit at a desk? Do they weight train, 5-6 days a week or only 2 or 3? So there's a lot of variables to it. But in general, they want to try to have consistency. So when I work with people with eating disorders, we just try to have consistency. And then we know that if they do something that's inconsistent with our plan, that they might have a bloating effect. They now are aware that that is potentially going to happen. So therefore, if they feel the effects of that the next day, they're less likely to be triggered to do bad behaviors because they could almost predict it was going to come. Okay? So it's very helpful to know sodium effects when it comes to fat loss and aesthetics, so that way you can know that you're not gaining a pound of fat in one day, and it also lets you know that you shouldn't trigger bad behaviors or over-exercise just based on one bad day of reading, okay, like body weight scale reading. Okay. The next thing we look at is performance. So having adequate sodium intake is amazing for performance. Helps with hydration and actually duration of abilities. When you become dehydrated, your body starts down-regulating your abilities, like of endurance, strength, everything. Okay, and also being hydrated protects your muscles and joints because they have more kind of fluidity to them. There's more stretchiness. There's more protection and cushion to your joints. So there's a lot of benefits performance-wise to having good amounts of sodium. You also can increase, like we said, that the amount of glycogen that you hold, which your body is holding. Again, glycogen is sodium, water, and carbohydrates in the form of glucose. It holds that in muscles. So if you are well hydrated, you have good carbohydrate intake, and you have good sodium intake, your muscles have nice, full kind of fuel tanks, full of energy that they can do everything you want to do them, like activity-wise. Okay? So it's really important to pay attention to sodium when you want to have good performance. So one of the things you can do is before a performance bout, so before a workout or before a big event or something, you actually can benefit from increasing your sodium, because that'll actually help you have more of that protection on muscles and joints, and it just kind of makes your body feel better hydrated and kind of like super duper ready for the activity. So when we have people who need to make weight for events, one of the things you can do, like people screw up weight cuts all the freaking time. They cut calories. They start eating like no food and drinking no fluid. It's absolutely stupid. They just don't know what the hell they're doing. They're listening to somebody else who didn't know what the hell they did. They don't understand the science of nutrition. So you have people getting ready for like strength events, like powerlifting meets, and they're like, it's like Tuesday, and they're like, I'm gonna go ahead and start cutting my calories. I'm gonna stop drinking water. I'm like, you're a dumbass. Why the hell would you do any of that on a Tuesday? So if the event isn't until Saturday. So really what you want to do is, if you reduce carbohydrate and sodium intake, and you replace the calories you lost from carbohydrates with fats, okay? You're just consuming less carbs but not less calories. And you're consuming less sodium, okay? Limiting it to as little as possible before the weigh-in. You can drink as much water as you want, and you can still have all the calories you want. Because what it's going to do is it's going to prevent your body from being able to form glycogen, because you don't have the carbs and the sodium available. Therefore, any water you drink will not be retained, and you can still stay hydrated and still feel good for your meat. So you can actually cut water weight. I mean, I've cut like 6 to 8 pounds off people in 12 hours, and they did exceptional. They didn't have to cut calories. They didn't feel dehydrated. They didn't feel beat up the week before, like run down going into the event. So it's absolutely asinine what some people do when they try to get ready for events, because they just don't understand the science of nutrition. So you do not need to cut water out ahead of an event, and you absolutely do not need to start reducing calories the week of. If you're trying to lose fat, which is the only reason why you'd reduce calories, and you're only doing it the week before the event, you're an idiot and you're way the hell behind. Okay? So that ain't going to make diddly. If you needed to cut body fat, that needed to start weeks ago. If you're just trying to cut water weight, then you don't reduce water, you reduce carbs and sodium. Okay? Cool. Then when you want to refill your sodium, you want to make sure that you have sodium and you consume carbohydrates. If you don't consume carbohydrates, your body will not be able to store the water. So you can have all the sodium you want, all the water you want, but if you don't have carbohydrates, it can't hold on to the water. So you're not actually replenishing, rehydrating yourself. You're just going to piss out everything you're drinking. So you have to have carbohydrates with the sodium and water. And it's best to have mixed sources of carbohydrates. You can have liquid carbohydrates and solid food carbohydrates. And when you have the solid food carbohydrates, have slower digestion carbohydrates advanced like hours in front of the event. And then you can have faster digesting solid food carbohydrates as you get closer to the event. So that's going to help you get way more hydrated, create way more glycogen by having variable sources of carbohydrates timed to the event that you're looking for, assuming you're also consuming sodium with those carbohydrates and drinking a lot of water. Okay? So last thing we'll just cover real quick is just some foods that are high in sodium. So ones you want to be careful of if you feel like that your food intake is an issue. And then also these are foods that are high in sodium, so if you're trying to replenish sodium for performance effects, okay? So you can look at canned, cured, and prepackaged meats like deli meats. These are like sausages, like bacon, all that kind of stuff, like kind of like animal meats that are prepackaged, not like cut off the cow and throw in the frying pan. So that's going to have some type of nitrites or nitrates or sodium-based kind of preservatives with it to make sure the meat doesn't turn gray and get all nasty looking before you can cook it. So frozen dinners and meals, so like Weight Watchers and like pizzas and burritos and stuff like lasagnas, raviolis. So canned foods like that are going to be really high in sodium typically. Also, like we said, soups are really high in sodium. They also have the liquid aspect, so that helps you with hydration as well. So you can also look at salted foods. Now this is kind of common sense, is what foods would be high in sodium are things that are salted. Duh. But you still have to mention it. So like nuts that have salted, that are salted, French fries. So other things that kind of just come salted that we don't think of adding salt to. And then you also have sauces like soy sauce, teriyaki sauce, like barbecue sauces and other things like that. So those are things that do contain sodium that you want to be careful or aware of. You can avoid those if you're trying to reduce sodium, or you can actually hyper-focus on those if you're trying to increase sodium. So this is a quick little tidbit things about sodium. Just get your mind thinking and recognize that it is not the biggest concern if you have hypertension. Look at it, okay, address it, pay attention to it. But don't just blame sodium, think you address sodium, and then be done with it. You still need to address stress, you still need to address being overweight, and you still need to address inactivity. Okay? So look at that stuff, see if there's things you can do in any of those. If you do efforts towards those and you try to manage your sodium intake, you will have the best chance at controlling blood pressure. Okay? So remember, for weight loss effects, if you have variable amounts of sodium, you are going to have variable body weight per day. Doesn't mean you got fatter, you're just holding more water. And then again, if you feel like if you do have variable sodium intakes, you are going to have variable degrees of bloat. Just recognize that that's going to go away. So don't get triggered, don't feel like you're getting fat, okay? Just give it a day, just keep drinking lots of water, reduce your sodium that day, and the bloat will go away, okay? For performance, remember sodium is super duper important, so make sure you have good amount of sodium before a performance activity. So again, it helps with hydration, gives you duration of ability so you don't wear out so fast, and it protects your muscles and the joints. If you're going to do a weigh-in, remember that the week of the weigh-in, you just have to reduce carbs and sodium. You don't have to reduce water intake, and you don't have to reduce calories. Okay? And then when you refuel, make sure you have multiple variable digestive rates of carbohydrates. Have liquids and solids, and slow and fast digesting solids. Cool. Hope this was helpful. If you have any more specific questions about sodium, reach out to us and let us know, and we'll be happy to address them either directly to you or we'll make another podcast about it. Okay? Cool. If you like the information, please share it with family and friends. The more people we help, the happier the world will be. Also, if you like this information, you can find more from us on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter at Brutal Iron Gym. And if you have any questions, feedback, or suggestions, we'd love to hear from you. The podcast is for you, so we want to know what you want to learn about. And you can tell us at our email at brutalirongym@gmail.com. As always, I hope this was helpful. And thank you for listening. And thank you for watching.